The rain came down in sheets, washing over the rolling fields of the countryside like a grey curtain. The wind howled through the trees, rattling loose branches and sending the scent of wet earth and grass drifting through the air. At the edge of a small, quiet farm, tucked under the overhang of an old red barn, lay Lucky. Lucky was a yellow Labrador with a soft golden coat, now silvering around the muzzle. He had once been a rescue dog, strong, tireless, brave. He had sniffed through rubble, crossed rivers, found lost hikers, and even once pulled a child from a frozen pond. But those days were behind him now. He had earned his retirement. These days, Lucky spent his time lounging in the hay, wandering the fields, and keeping lazy watch over the chickens and goats. The humans fed him well, spoke to him gently, and let him nap as long as he wanted. The barn, with its warm straw and low wooden walls, had become his sanctuary, but even in retirement, Lucky's instincts never fully turned off. He heard the faint cry before he saw them. It was distant at first, almost swallowed by the rain. A high-pitched mewling, weak, scared. Lucky lifted his head from the hay. Ears twitching, he stood slowly, joints stiff but still sturdy, and padded toward the barn doors. The rain lashed against his face as he stepped outside, fur quickly soaking. The sound came again. Lucky trotted across the yard, nose lifted, body alert, his paws squelched in the mud, and his ears flattened against the wind. He passed the chicken coop, rounded the garden fence, and came to a stop near the gravel road that led in from the hills. There, just off the edge of the lane, lay a crumpled body, a mother lynx. She was beautiful even in death. Her spotted coat matted with rain, eyes closed, breath gone. Her side was smeared with fresh blood, likely hit by a passing vehicle that hadn't even stopped. But it wasn't her Lucky had heard. Next to her, huddled against her belly for warmth and comfort that was no longer there, were 3 tiny lynx cubs, barely the size of house cats, soaked to the bone, trembling. One let out a tiny squeak, the same cry that had called Lucky here. He stood still for a moment, watching. The cubs looked up, too cold to be afraid. They blinked at him with wild golden eyes, as if unsure whether this was help or another threat. Lucky didn't hesitate. With the same gentle care he once used to carry wounded animals to safety, he stepped forward, leaned down, and opened his mouth wide enough to softly grasp the nape of the first cub. It squealed, then went still. He lifted it carefully, no pressure, no pain, and turned back toward the barn. It took 3 trips. Each time, Lucky returned through the storm, rain soaking his fur, carrying the next cub across the yard and into the safety of the barn. Inside, he nudged aside a patch of dry hay in the warmest corner of his stall. Deep beneath a thick old quilt the farmer had laid down weeks ago for him to sleep on. One by one, he tucked the cubs in. They shivered and squirmed but didn't resist. Instinct told him this creature, large, foreign, but calm, meant no harm. After the last cub was safely inside, Lucky lay down next to them, curling his body in a protective crescent. He nudged the hay higher against their sides, shielding them from the draft. Then he rested his head on his paws, eyes watching the barn door. The storm raged on outside, but inside the hay stall, it was warm, safe. Hours passed. The rain slowed. The wind softened. The cubs stopped trembling and began to breathe more evenly, little chests rising and falling beneath the damp fur. One of them, Luna, the smallest, pressed against Lucky's leg and let out a tiny sigh. Lucky closed his eyes. He had never had puppies of his own. He had never needed them. He'd saved people. That was his purpose, his mission. But this was something else. The next morning, the sky broke open in soft light. The farmer's boy opened the barn to bring fresh feed, and stopped dead at the sight. Lucky curled in his stall. 3 wild cubs sleeping against his belly. All of them alive. All of them calm. "Dad!" the boy yelled. "You gotta come see this." The farmer knew better than to disturb them. He watched from the stall door as Lucky lifted his head, gave one gentle thump of his tail, and then lowered it again. The cubs would stay, at least for now. The authorities would be called. Of course. Wildlife agents would eventually come and assess the cubs' health, determine if they could be rehabilitated and returned to the wild. But the farm was remote. The system slow. It could take weeks before anyone came. So for now, Lucky took on the role he hadn't been asked for but had chosen anyway. Guardian. Each day, he licked their fur clean. He growled softly when the barn cat got too curious. He let them climb over him, tug at his ears, even sleep draped across his back. He watched them grow stronger, rowdier, louder. He learned their names by how they acted. Luna, the quiet, soft-eyed cub, always the first to curl up against him. Leo, bold and clumsy, who pounced too hard and tumbled into hay piles. Lulu, fast and clever, who tried to sneak out the barn door whenever it creaked open. And they, in turn, learned to trust him completely. The humans were amazed, but not surprised. Lucky had always had a gift, something in him that knew when something needed saving. And though he no longer wore a search vest or rode in rescue trucks, that gift had never left him. One storm, 3 lives, one old dog with a heart still full of duty. Lucky had found a new mission. And he wasn't letting go. The morning air hung thick with the scent of dew and hay. The storm had passed, leaving the land soaked and glistening, and the farm bathed in soft golden light. Birds returned to the branches, and the animals stirred from their shelters. But inside the red barn, something extraordinary was happening. Lucky lay curled around the 3 lynx cubs, Luna, Leo, and Lulu, as if they had been born to him. Their soft, wild fur pressed into his side, still damp in patches but warm and safe. The old Labrador no longer stirred at every sound outside. His ears twitched. Of course, he was always alert, but his attention was fully focused on the fragile creatures nestled against him. He had chosen them, and he wasn't about to let them go. But outside the barn, someone else had made a different choice. Martin Shaw, the owner of the farm and a lifelong man of the land, walked up the gravel path toward the barn. a hot mug of coffee in one hand, a phone in the other. He had just gotten off a call with the local wildlife center. They were ready to send a truck to collect the lynx cubs as soon as possible, maybe even that afternoon. He sighed. He didn't dislike animals. Far from it. He loved this land and respected every creature on it. But lynxes were wild, dangerous even as juveniles. They didn't belong on a farm with chickens, goats, and children. They needed proper care from professionals, experts. He approached the barn door and opened it slowly. Inside, the scent of straw and animals hit him. Familiar and comforting. And there they were, just as his son had described. Lucky curled around the cubs like a furry wall. His big brown eyes blinking slowly. Head rising slightly when Martin stepped in. The lynx cubs lifted their heads sleepily. One of them, Leo, Martin guessed, let out a tiny hiss. More curious than hostile. Martin stepped forward. Lucky rose. And then something completely unexpected happened. Lucky walked to the edge of the stall, positioned himself in front of the wooden gate, and lay down. Right in the way. Lucky, Martin said calmly, I know what you're doing. But it's not your decision. The old dog didn't move. He let out a soft, low whine, not angry, not threatening, but full of something harder to ignore. Sadness. Plea. He looked up at Martin. Ears back, tail still, eyes full of determination. Martin sighed and walked back toward the gate. As he reached to open it, Lucky let out another soft sound. This one sharper, closer to a cry. Martin froze. You really don't want me to take them? Lucky didn't bark, didn't growl. He just stayed right where he was. A golden guardian in a barn of straw and morning light. Martin stood there for a long moment. Then he slowly lowered his hand. All right, he muttered. A few weeks. That's it. You win, for now. Word spread slowly across the small community. The farmer keeping wild lynx cubs. With a dog raising them. Most people laughed, until they saw it for themselves. The cubs weren't just surviving. They were thriving. Lucky had become more than a protector. He was their family. He cleaned their fur with his warm, sandpaper tongue. He played gently with them, allowing them to pounce on his tail and tug his ears. Never snapping, never tired. When they got too excited, he herded them calmly into a corner of the barn and curled around them until they calmed. He taught them how to be safe in their new world. They, in turn, softened to his touch. They stopped hissing. They stopped hiding. They followed him like chicks follow their mother hen. Luna would often curl between his paws to nap. Leo became obsessed with chasing Lucky's tail. Lulu liked to sit on his back like a proud little queen, purring with contentment as Lucky wandered the barn. Even Martin's son, Jamie, watched wide-eyed from the sidelines. It's like they think he's their dad, he whispered once. Martin didn't answer. He watched, arms crossed, a frown deep in thought. Every instinct told him this was unnatural, that it couldn't last, but something inside him, some quieter part, wondered if maybe nature was simply making its own decisions. Still, he kept the number for the wildlife center pinned to the fridge. Just in case. Weeks passed. The cubs grew stronger, faster, their movements sharpened, their instincts came alive. Yet, every evening, they still returned to Lucky's side. When the sun dipped low, and the sky filled with the scent of firewood and distant rain, the barn became their sanctuary, Lucky's stall, their home. One night, Martin came to check on them. Flashlight in hand, rain pattered gently outside, soft enough not to bother the animals. Inside, he found the usual scene. Lucky, curled in a wide C shape. 3 lynx cubs, each tucked neatly against him, breathing slow and deep. The light caught on Lucky's face. His eyes were open, watching. He wasn't sleeping, not yet. Martin stepped closer and knelt just outside the stall. Lucky met his gaze. "You've done something I didn't expect," Martin whispered. Lucky blinked. Martin rubbed the back of his neck. "You've raised them, like your own, and you didn't ask for permission." No reply, just the steady, protective rise and fall of the old dog's chest. Martin exhaled. "I guess we wait a little longer." He stood, turned off the light, and let the barns settle into silence. By the end of the month, Martin stopped calling the wildlife center. He didn't say it out loud, didn't admit anything had changed. But one morning, Jamie found the printed adoption form for temporary wildlife guardianship sitting on the kitchen table. Half filled out. Lucky had won more than just a few weeks. He had earned trust. And as the cubs grew, so did their bond, unshaken, unspoken, unbreakable. Wherever they ended up, whatever the future held, one thing had become clear to everyone who saw it. A dog didn't need to be the same species to be a father. He just needed to stay when it mattered. Spring came gently to the valley. The rains softened, the sun returned, and the grass grew green again across the hills that rolled beyond the Shaw family's farm. Birds nested in the rafters of the barn. The scent of blossoms drifted through the open windows of the farmhouse. And inside the old red barn, a story continued, one that no one had seen coming. It began as a curiosity. Neighbors, friends, even strangers from 2 towns over started showing up, leaning over the barn gate in disbelief, smartphones in hand, whispering things like, "Is that a lynx? And is that a dog?" They didn't believe it until they saw it, the old Labrador, curled in the straw like a lion in repose, and 3 wild lynx cubs napping, playing, or climbing on him like he was their living jungle gym. "He raised them?" someone asked. Martin Shaw would shrug. "Didn't ask me for permission. Just did it." People watched with wide eyes as Lucky licked a paw clean, or rolled over to let Lulu climb on his back. The story began to spread beyond the community. A local paper did a short article. A photo of Lucky lying nose to nose with Luna went modestly viral. But despite the attention, Lucky seemed unaware, or unconcerned. He remained as he always had, calm, steady, grounded in something bigger than himself. He had work to do. And he still had a family to care for. Of the 3 cubs, Luna was always the quietest, the most cautious. She rarely played as rough as Leo or leaped as far as Lulu. She stayed close to Lucky during stormy nights, And when loud noises startled her, like the backfire of Martin's tractor, she would dart under the hay until she could peek out and find him again. But there was something else about her. Something deeper. She watched Lucky constantly, not just as a source of safety, but as if trying to understand something about him, to learn it for herself. Then, one morning, something happened. The barn was quiet. The sun cast warm stripes through the gaps in the wood slats. Leo and Lulu were wrestling near the trough, paws thudding softly against the ground. Lucky lay near the stall door, eyes closed, tail twitching slowly. Luna stood a few feet away, watching. Then she walked up to him, paused, lowered her head, and gently, shyly, pressed the side of her face against Lucky's muzzle. He opened one eye. She purred, faintly, a small sound, high-pitched and uncertain. Then came another sound, so soft it could have been mistaken for wind. A breathy, whispering mrrr. The barn fell still. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a call. It was a wordless murmur, one that, if you listened with your heart, might have sounded like "bar." Lucky lifted his head slightly, licked her forehead once, then rested his head back down. From that day on, Luna was never far from him. Time moved forward. The cubs grew stronger, sleeker, faster. Their spots darkened. Their legs grew long and powerful. Their bodies honed for the wild. But they hadn't left yet. And as long as they stayed, Lucky stayed with them. Martin began noticing something else. Lucky had slowed. He still walked, still wagged his tail, still followed Jamie out to the pasture in the mornings. But he didn't run anymore. His naps lasted longer, his appetite was lighter, and when he stood up, it took a moment before his back legs caught up. He was aging. It was natural, expected, but it hit harder now, because Lucky had more to live for. And he wasn't about to let him down. One evening, Leo came in from the pasture limping. A minor cut on his hind leg, likely from stepping on a thorn. Martin cleaned it and dressed it, muttering reassurances. But it was Lucky who stayed beside him through the night. He didn't sleep, not for a minute. He lay pressed against Leo in the hay, licking his ear, nuzzling his neck, watching the barn shadows with sharp eyes, ready to growl if anything dared come too close. Leo healed in 2 days. Lucky didn't rest until he did. The same happened with Lulu a week later, a stomach bug. Mild but tiring. Again, Lucky stayed, guarded, gave her warmth when she shivered and licked her face when she whimpered. No one asked him to. No one ever did. It was just who he was. The farm continued its rhythm: sunrise, chores, visitors, sunset. The cubs learned how to climb, how to sneak, how to sharpen their claws without destroying the barn. But every day, they returned to Lucky, because he wasn't just a protector anymore. He was the center of their world, their first home, their constant heart. And even as his legs stiffened and his steps grew slower, Lucky never changed the way he looked at him, with unwavering attention, with pride, with that quiet, undying love that didn't need to be spoken to be known. One afternoon, As Martin sipped coffee on the porch and watched the cubs sprint across the far field, he noticed something. Lucky was lying just beyond the barn door, his head resting in the grass. He wasn't sleeping, he was watching, not with longing, but with something else. Peace. Because he had done it. He had given them what they needed to grow. Now they were almost ready. He had opened his heart when no one expected him to. And in return, 3 wild creatures, meant to be alone, meant to be afraid, had called him father. Martin stepped off the porch, walked across the yard, and crouched beside Lucky. "You're something else, old boy," he murmured, scratching behind his ears. Lucky leaned into the touch. Just once. Then turned his head, eyes scanning the field, watching Luna leap through the grass like a silent shadow. She paused, glanced back toward him, and gave that same faint, whispering call. "M-R-R." He heard it, and he smiled. In his own way. It began with the sound of tires on gravel. The conservation truck rolled up the long dirt road leading to the shore farm, kicking up a thin cloud of dust that shimmered in the morning light. A neatly dressed woman in a green field uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand, followed by 2 rangers. Behind the truck, a large, well-ventilated transport crate was strapped down, built for wild animals. Reinforced, secure, they had come for the lynx cubs. Inside the red barn, the world was still. Lucky lay in his usual corner of hay, body curled protectively around Luna, Leo, and Lulu. The 3 lynx were no longer cubs in size, but still cubs in spirit. They had grown into strong, wild creatures, sleek and agile, their coats rich with spotted patterns, their eyes fierce yet gentle. But in this moment, none of that wild grace was visible. They were trembling. The rangers approached slowly. The female conservationist smiled kindly, her voice low and respectful. "Mr. Shaw," she said to Martin, who stood stiffly at the barn door, "we're here to take the cubs. We'll relocate him to the main wildlife reserve. Then begin reintroduction. There's a soft release enclosure already prepped." Martin gave a quiet nod but didn't speak. His eyes were on the scene inside the barn, on the old dog who had raised the lynx cubs, and the wild family that wasn't quite ready to be wild without him. One of the rangers stepped forward with a soft loop of rope. "We'll take them gently," he said, "no darts. We don't want to scare them." But the moment they entered the stall, Leo reared back and hissed. When they reached for him, he leapt into the crate and tried to climb out the other side. His claws scratched against the metal with a desperate, rasping scrape. Lulu ducked under the blanket and let out a long, low whimper. She shivered, body pressed flat to the floor, unwilling to move. And Luna, quiet Luna, wrapped her paws around Lucky's neck and refused to let go. She didn't snarl, she didn't panic, she just held him, her wild face pressed into the old dog's golden fur, her eyes wide and silent, tail wrapped around his belly. Lucky didn't move, he didn't growl, he didn't try to block them. He just lay there, still, calm. But his eyes said everything. "Don't. Not yet." Martin cleared his throat. "They've been with him since their mother died. The ranger nodded gently. "We know, sir, but they need a wild environment. One where they can roam freely." "They have one," Martin said, voice rising. "You see those hills behind the pasture? That's 40 acres of uncut, unfarmed land, forest, scrub, even a creek. I fenced it off last year for the goats. Haven't used it since. It backs right up to the national conservation boundary." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying," Martin continued, "leave them here, not to keep, not to cage, to live, to grow wild, right here. Let them come and go. Let Lucky see them. Let them learn to leave slowly. When they're ready." Silence filled the barn. The rangers glanced at one another. The conservationist looked at the lynx. Then at Lucky, still curled in the straw, still being held by a cat that should be running free, but chose to stay close. Finally, she stepped forward and crouched beside Martin. "Are you willing to be the guardian until they leave on their own?" "Yes," he said immediately. "And you understand we'll still monitor them. We'll tag them, check on their progress, make sure they don't grow too dependent." Martin nodded. "I don't want to stop them from being wild. I just don't want to break their hearts before they're ready." The woman looked at Lucky. He gave one slow blink. His tail thudded once against the straw. That was all. She stood up, signed the clipboard, and turned to her team. "Unstrap the crate," she said. "We're not taking them today." That afternoon, the old goat pasture was opened. The fence was modified, wildlife safe, climbable, but tall enough to keep them protected while they grew more independent. Martin and Jamie worked with the rangers to install a soft tracking system. Non-invasive and lightweight, food was gradually introduced in the surrounding woods to encourage foraging. But the heart of the enclosure, the place the cubs still returned to every night, was the red barn. And Lucky. Luna stayed pressed to him the longest that first night. Leo eventually went out to explore the woods with Lulu, bounding through the brush like small predators relearning their instincts. But Luna stayed close, watching from the shadows, always aware of Lucky's breathing, his position. And Lucky, he never scolded them, never barked when they wandered too far, never whimpered when they came home late. He just waited, every day, at the barn door, watching the trees. Weeks passed. The cubs ventured farther. They began to stalk wild game, mice, rabbits, even a deer once, though they weren't ready for it. Rangers reported sightings of them deeper in the reserve, moving with more confidence. But they always came back. Every few nights, Lucky would raise his head and hear the familiar rustle outside. 3 shadows slipping through the grass. 3 hearts that had not forgotten. One evening, as the stars blinked to life above the barn, Luna returned alone. She didn't curl up beside Lucky. She sat, staring at him, her body taller now, more mature. She looked not like a kitten, but like a lynx. Still, her eyes were the same. She stepped forward, pressed her forehead against his, and let out that soft sound again. "Mrrr." Lucky sighed deeply, closed his eyes, and leaned into her one last time. Because now, he knew, the goodbye wouldn't come all at once. It would come gently, across seasons, But love would always return. Years passed, quietly and surely, as they always do. The seasons came and went across the shore farm. Springs brought rain and blooming grass. Summers baked the hills golden. Autumns dusted the ground with fallen leaves. And winters whispered gently through the woods. The world changed in small, steady ways, but at the heart of the farm, one constant remained for a time longer. Lucky, the old yellow Labrador who once pulled children from rivers and rescued hikers from storms, had long since slowed. His steps were careful now, deliberate. His fur had faded to white around his muzzle and belly. He no longer chased chickens or barked at the wind. Most days, he rested beneath the big oak on the knoll behind the barn, his favorite spot, where he could feel the breeze and watch the trees sway. He had lived well beyond anyone's expectations. And he had never stopped waiting. Even when he no longer rose to greet every visitor. Even when his eyes grew cloudy and his legs stiff. Every evening, as the sun dipped low, Lucky would lie beneath the oak, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the old goat pasture, where wild things moved, and often, they came, sometimes one, sometimes two, but more often than not, all three, Luna, Leo, and Lulu, no longer cubs, no longer unsure. They had grown into majestic lynxes, strong, fierce, agile, with coats thick and beautiful, their bodies built for the wilderness. Rangers said they had fully reintegrated into the protected reserve, hunting on their own, living freely, but the three never strayed far for long. Because some bonds don't vanish with time. They deepen, and they never forgot who raised them. On quiet days, they returned, slipping through the trees like ghosts, pressing through the pasture gate left open just for them. They never made a sound. But Lucky always knew. His tail would thump once. His ears would twitch. And the moment they reached him, he'd lift his head and nuzzle them in turn. They never stayed long. They didn't need to. Just enough to say, "We're still here. We remember." It was early spring when Lucky passed. The sky was overcast, a blanket of soft gray stretching across the valley. The fields were wet from a night of light rain. Birds chirped. Goats bleated, and the world moved gently around him, as if not wanting to disturb the moment. Lucky lay on his side beneath the oak tree. He didn't suffer, he didn't struggle, he simply rested, and as his breaths grew slower, softer, more distant, he was not alone. They had come. Luna, Leo, and Lulu lay beside him, one pressed against his belly, one at his back, and one with her chin resting gently on his outstretched paw. They did not cry. They did not run. They simply stayed, like children holding the hand of a father who had never asked for thanks, only trust. When Martin found them that afternoon, the three lynxes lifted their heads but did not move. He stood at a respectful distance, hat in hand, eyes misted. He didn't say a word. He just watched as Luna licked Lucky's muzzle once, softly, then stood. The others followed, and together, they turned and disappeared into the forest. A week later, Martin returned to the oak with his son, Jamie. They brought with them a bundle of wood, a hammer, and a carefully wrapped statue carved from stone and bronze. They dug a small foundation in the grass where Lucky had last lain. The statue was simple, about 2 feet tall. It depicted a Labrador lying down, tail curled, eyes forward. Around him were 3 lynx cubs, nestled close. It didn't need explanation. Beneath the statue, Martin fixed a brass plaque that read, "You don't need the same blood to be a family." The story of Lucky and the lynxes didn't die with him. Photos of the statue were posted online by Jamie. They spread faster than either of them expected. Animal shelters, wildlife groups, rescue organizations all shared it. Captions like, "A dog raised lynxes. They never forgot. Love needs no species. The father who stayed." News outlets picked it up. A short documentary was filmed. Children in schools drew pictures of Lucky and his wild cubs. A wildlife sanctuary in Canada painted a mural. People came to visit the small farm, to leave flowers by the statue, to sit beneath the oak tree in silence. And sometimes, if they were lucky, they caught a glimpse, a shadow in the trees, a flash of silver fur. The lynxes still came. They no longer needed to. But they came anyway. Because family doesn't end when breath does. Because love leaves footprints no rain can wash away. And somewhere in the woods beyond the shore farm, 3 wild hearts still remember the warmth of straw, the feel of golden fur, and the steady beat of a heart that taught them what it means to belong. Forever.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.